Michael Carson, 42 years old, CEO of a $3 billion financial empire, was on his knees on the marble floor of his Hamptons estate, holding his 3-year-old son who wouldn't stop crying. 3 private pediatricians stood in the living room with their medical bags, unable to do anything. 2 specialized nurses watched helplessly. Little Jake had a fever of 104 degrees that no medication could bring down, convulsions that terrified everyone, and none of the most expensive professionals in America knew what to do. Michael, the man who controlled banks and corporations across the country, the man who had never cried in public, was weeping desperately as his son burned in his arms. It was at that moment that Rosa Martinez, the 50-year-old housekeeper who had cleaned the estate for 10 years, walked into the room with determined steps. She had no degrees, no medical certifications. She only had the experience of a mother who had raised 5 children in a small Texas border town. And what she did in the next 10 minutes not only saved the child's life, but forever changed the life of the billionaire who had always looked down on ordinary people. Because sometimes true wisdom doesn't come from framed diplomas on walls, but from the calloused hands of those who have lived real life. The Carson estate rose majestically on the cliffs overlooking the Atlantic in the Hamptons, with its 22 rooms, infinity pool, professionally maintained gardens, and an ocean view that rivaled the most luxurious resorts. It was the symbol of Michael Carson's success, a man who at 42 had built a financial empire starting from nothing. Michael had been born into a working-class family in Pittsburgh. His father was a factory worker, his mother a homemaker. But he had studied economics at Wharton, fought his way into the finance world with ruthless intelligence and limitless ambition. At 30, he was already a millionaire. At 35, he had founded his investment firm. At 40, he had married Amanda, a 28-year-old model, and together they had Jake. But the marriage lasted only 2 years. Amanda couldn't handle the constant absences, the priorities always oriented toward work, the emotional coldness of a man who saw everything as an investment or a loss. She left when Jake was 1 year old, leaving the child with Michael and returning to Manhattan to resume her career. Michael reacted as he always did, by hiring staff, a Filipino nanny who spoke 4 languages, 2 pediatric nurses alternating 24 hours a day, a child nutritionist, a developmental psychologist. Jake grew up in a gilded cage of paid professionals. Then there was Rosa Martinez, the housekeeper, 50 years old, sturdy, with hands calloused from work, and a Texas accent she never bothered to hide. She had been hired 10 years earlier when Michael bought the estate. She came every day at 6 in the morning, cleaned, cooked when necessary, and left at 6 in the evening. Michael had never spoken to her for more than 5 minutes in 10 years. To him, she was invisible, part of the furniture, like the paintings on the walls or the Ming vases in the entrance. That July morning started like all the others. Michael was in his upstairs office, video conferencing with Japanese investors. It was 8 o'clock. Jake was having breakfast with the nanny Roslyn in the main living room. Rosa was cleaning the marble floors in the east wing of the estate. Roslyn was the first to notice something was wrong. Jake, usually a lively child, seemed lethargic. He didn't want to eat. He complained that his head hurt. Roslyn measured his temperature, 100.4. Nothing too concerning, she thought. A summer flu. But within 2 hours, the temperature rose to 103. Jake started crying uncontrollably. He didn't want to be touched, screaming that everything hurt. Roslyn called one of the pediatric nurses, who administered acetaminophen and applied cold compresses. But the fever kept rising. At 11 o'clock, Michael was interrupted in the middle of an urgent phone call. Jake had a fever of 104 and was having convulsions. Michael ran downstairs, his heart pounding in a way he had never experienced. All his billions, all his contacts, all his power, and his son was burning before his eyes. The convulsions lasted 2 minutes that felt like an eternity. Jake's little body stiffened, his eyes rolled back. When he finally calmed down, Michael ordered the best pediatricians in New York to be called immediately. Not 1, 3. He wanted the brightest minds, the most expensive professionals. Within an hour, 3 pediatricians arrived at the estate with their bags full of diagnostic equipment. Dr. Bernard, head of pediatrics at Mount Sinai; Dr. Gentile, specialist in pediatric infectious diseases; Dr. Russo, renowned pediatric neurologist. Together, they billed $3,000 an hour. But as they examined Jake, as they asked questions, as they consulted with each other speaking in medical jargon no one else understood, the child's fever wouldn't drop. The medications weren't working. The convulsions returned every 20 minutes. Jake cried desperately, calling for a mother who wasn't there. And Michael, the man who had faced financial sharks, who had closed $100 million deals without flinching, was on his knees on the floor, holding his son, feeling completely powerless. Tears flowed down his face, without him even realizing it. His whole world, all his success, meant nothing if he couldn't save the only person he truly loved. It was at that moment that Rosa Martinez entered the room. She had finished cleaning the kitchen and was about to start on the upstairs bathrooms when she heard the child's desperate crying. She approached, saw the scene through the half-open living room door. The rich and powerful father reduced to a desperate man. The expensive doctors who seemed lost. The child suffering. Rosa didn't ask permission. She entered with determined steps, knelt beside Michael, and with a calm but authoritative voice said something no one expected. Rosa looked at Jake with the eyes of someone who had seen this scene many times. Then she turned to the doctors with a confidence that left them speechless. She asked to see the child's hands and feet. The doctors, offended that a housekeeper dared to interfere, hesitated, but Michael, desperate, ordered them to let her. Rosa gently took Jake's little feet. They were ice cold, despite the extremely high fever. The nails had a bluish tinge. She checked his hands. Same thing. Then, with expert movements, she placed one hand on the child's forehead and the other on his belly. The forehead was burning, but the belly was cold. She looked up at the doctors and said in a tone that brooked no argument that this wasn't a simple fever. It was what her grandmother in Texas called trapped heat, when the heat concentrates in the head, but the body turns to ice. The doctors exchanged skeptical glances, ready to dismiss these folks' superstitions. But Rosa didn't wait for their approval. She turned to Michael and told him to take Jake to the bathroom immediately. They needed lukewarm water, not cold. They needed towels, and they needed trust. Michael, without understanding, but without alternatives, obeyed. In the main bathroom, Rosa had them fill the tub with lukewarm water. The doctors protested. With such a high fever, cold water was standard procedure. But Rosa shook her head firmly. Cold water would further constrict the blood vessels in the extremities, she explained, trapping even more heat in the brain. They needed to rebalance the body's temperature gradually instead. As Michael gently immersed Jake in the lukewarm water, Rosa showed him how to massage the little feet and hands softly, to get the blood circulating again. Then she took a wet towel and placed it on Jake's neck, not on his forehead. She explained that the neck was the key point to bring down brain fever. Dr. Bernard, exasperated, intervened, saying this was folk medicine without scientific basis. Rosa looked him straight in the eye and responded that her grandmother had saved dozens of children with these techniques when there were no hospitals in her village. And if his degrees were so useful, why was Jake still burning after an hour of professional care? The silence that followed was eloquent. Michael looked at Rosa with new eyes, seeing her truly for the first time in 10 years. This woman he had treated as invisible, who earned in a month what he spent on a dinner, knew something that all the doctors' diplomas hadn't taught them. In the next 10 minutes, something miraculous began to happen. Jake's feet, under Rosa's constant massage, started warming up. The bluish color disappeared. The child gradually stopped crying, his body relaxing in the lukewarm water. The fever, which had stubbornly remained at 104 for 3 hours, finally began to drop. 103.8, 103.5, 103. The doctors measured in disbelief. Dr. Gentile murmured something about peripheral thermoregulation and how, in certain particular cases, unconventional techniques could be effective. But everyone knew the truth. Rosa had done in 10 minutes what they couldn't do in 3 hours. When Jake was finally out of danger, dried and wrapped in a soft bathrobe, he fell asleep in his father's arms. The fever had dropped to 102, stable. The convulsions didn't return. For the first time in hours, the child was breathing peacefully. Michael looked at Rosa with a mixture of gratitude, shame, and wonder. This woman had saved his son, and he didn't even know how many children she had never asked her anything about her life, in 10 years had never had a real conversation with her. The doctors, paid handsomely for their useless visit, left in silence, leaving prescriptions and recommendations that no one was listening to anymore. The nurses returned to their shifts, and Michael remained sitting on the living room couch, with Jake asleep in his arms, and Rosa, who had already gone back to work, as if nothing had happened. But something had changed, profoundly, and Michael knew he could no longer ignore it. The next day, Jake woke up with a mild fever. He ate the broth Rosa had prepared and gradually returned to being the lively child he always was. The doctors confirmed the crisis had passed. But Michael couldn't forget the scene from the day before. He kept thinking about Rosa, her practical wisdom that had surpassed years of academic medical training. And above all, he kept feeling ashamed of how he had treated her for a decade. That evening, when Rosa was about to leave the estate, Michael stopped her. He asked if she could sit with him for a moment. Rosa seemed surprised. In 10 years, Mr. Carson had never asked her to sit down, but she nodded, setting down her duster and sitting cautiously on the edge of an armchair. Michael thanked Rosa for what she had done. Then he began asking questions he should have asked 10 years earlier. He asked about her family, her life, and Rosa, slowly, began to tell her story. She was born in a small Texas border town, youngest of 7 siblings. Her mother helped the village women during births, treating fevers and wounds with remedies passed down through generations. At 20, she married Jose, a construction worker. 5 children in 8 years. Then Jose died in a work accident, when the youngest was 10 years old. Rosa found herself a widow at 40, with 5 children to support. She moved north, started as a housekeeper, sending every penny to her children who remained in Texas with their grandparents. Now they were grown: engineer, teacher, mechanic, nurse, law student. Rosa had raised them with immense sacrifices. Michael listened in silence, feeling ashamed. This woman had more dignity and wisdom than all the professionals he hired for $500 an hour, and he had never even asked her a personal question in 10 years. He apologized with true humility for how he had treated her, for how he had ignored her. Rosa said he had always been a correct employer, but Michael shook his head. Being correct wasn't enough. He had treated Rosa as an object, not as a person. It was a bitter realization, but necessary.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
In the following days, Michael began to change. He started noticing things that had been invisible before. He noticed Rosa always arrived at 6 in the morning, even when it rained, even when she clearly had a cold. He noticed she brought lunch from home in a worn plastic container, eating standing up in the kitchen while continuing to work. He noticed that when Jake cried or got hurt, it was always Rosa who managed to calm him better than anyone else, with a combination of gentleness and firmness that the professional nannies didn't have. He noticed the simple dishes Rosa occasionally cooked were the ones Jake ate with the most appetite. And he noticed above all that Rosa worked with silent dignity, doing every task perfectly, never complaining, never asking for anything. She was proud in her work, even though that work was cleaning a billionaire's floors. Michael began making small gestures. He told her to take a proper lunch break, to eat sitting in the dining room like anyone else. Rosa protested, saying it wasn't appropriate, but Michael insisted. He raised her salary by 50% without her asking. When she tried to refuse, saying it was too much, he told her it was actually still too little for what she did. But the biggest change happened in the relationship between Rosa and Jake. The child, who before saw her only as the cleaning lady, began spending time with her. Rosa taught him small things: how to tie knots, how to plant seeds in the garden, how to make bread. They were simple, practical lessons, so different from the structured lessons from the professional tutors Jake had always had. And Jake flourished. He laughed more, played more, seemed happier. Michael watched this transformation with a mixture of joy and melancholy. His son needed something all the money couldn't buy: authenticity, genuine human warmth, not professional. One day, Michael asked Rosa if she would be willing to become not just the housekeeper, but also a kind of governess and maternal figure for Jake. He would pay her double, give her a room in the estate so she wouldn't have to travel every day, cover all expenses for her youngest son's university. Rosa thought about it for days. She was tempted. The offer was generous, but in the end, she gently declined. She explained that Jake needed his father, not another paid figure to take care of him. What happened during the emergency was important because it showed Michael something he needed to understand: that love and care cannot be delegated. Michael was struck by these words. Rosa was right. He had always thought that hiring the best professionals was the way to be a good father. But he was actually just buying substitutes for his presence, and no nanny, however qualified, could replace a parent who is truly there. It was a hard lesson, but necessary, and Michael slowly began reorganizing his life. He refused some business opportunities that would have kept him away for weeks. He started leaving the office at 6 to have dinner with Jake. He reduced international travel. His partners and investors were surprised by this change, but Michael was unmovable. Rosa continued working at the estate, but their relationship had completely changed. She was no longer invisible. Michael asked her for advice, not just about Jake, but about life in general. He discovered that this woman with a middle school education had practical wisdom about relationships, priorities, and what really mattered, that far surpassed his Wharton degree. 6 months after the fever incident, Michael received a call that would force him to make the hardest choice of his life. His investment firm was about to close the biggest deal of his career, the acquisition of a Swiss bank for $2 billion. It was the opportunity he had been waiting for years, the one that would make him not just rich, but truly powerful in the world of European finance. There was only one problem. The final negotiations required his presence in Zurich for at least 6 consecutive weeks. No interruptions, no distractions. That's where everything would be decided. The old Michael wouldn't have hesitated for a second. He would have left Jake with the nannies and departed. But now, after everything that had happened, after everything he had understood, he hesitated. He talked about it with Rosa one evening while she prepared dinner, and he played with Jake on the kitchen floor. Rosa listened in silence as he laid out the dilemma. On one hand, the opportunity of a lifetime. On the other, 6 weeks away from his son at a crucial moment in his growth. Rosa didn't tell him what to do. It wasn't her role, but she asked him a simple question. When he reached the end of his life, what would he want to remember? The Swiss bank acquisition, or Jake's 6 years that would never come back? Michael spent sleepless nights reflecting. He called his partners, tried to negotiate partial presence, but they were clear. Either he was completely there, or the deal would go to someone else. It was all or nothing. The morning of the final decision, Michael woke up at 5. He hadn't slept. He went down to the kitchen and found Rosa preparing coffee, as always the first to arrive. They sat together at the kitchen table while dawn painted the sky pink over the Atlantic. Michael spoke at length, almost to himself. He talked about his father, the Pittsburgh factory worker who had worked his whole life to give his children a better education. His father who never had opportunities, who had always dreamed that Michael could reach heights he had never touched. And Michael had reached those heights. He had gone beyond his father's wildest dreams. But in the process, he had forgotten something his father never forgot. That money was a means, not an end. His father died poor, but surrounded by his family's love. Michael had all the money in the world, but until a few months ago, hadn't had a real relationship with his son. Rosa listened, her hands wrapped around the coffee cup. When Michael finished, she simply said that whatever decision he made, it had to be a decision that allowed him to look in the mirror without shame, and that Jake, one day, would understand and judge. At 9 that morning, Michael called his partners in Zurich. He told them he had to withdraw from the deal. There was incredulous silence, then protests, then threats. But Michael was unmovable. There were things more important than $2 billion. Things he had almost lost, but now understood were his true treasure. The deal went to a competitor. The financial papers talked about Salvatore's mysterious withdrawal from the biggest acquisition of the year. Some thought he had financial problems, others that he had lost his touch. No one understood the real reason, but Michael didn't regret it. That evening, he had dinner with Jake, put him to bed, read him a story. And when the child fell asleep holding his father's hand, Michael knew he had made the right choice. There was no acquisition, no deal, no profit worth this moment. 2 years later, Michael's life was unrecognizable from before. He had sold part of his shares in the investment firm, keeping only a consulting position that allowed him to work primarily from home. He had drastically reduced his activities, focusing only on projects that truly passionate him and didn't require time sacrifices with Jake. The Hamptons estate was physically the same, but the atmosphere was completely different. There were no more professional nannies, no more nurses 24 hours a day, no more consultants for every aspect of Jake's life. There was only Michael, who had learned to be a father, and Rosa, who continued to be not an employee, but part of the family. Jake, now 5, was a happy and balanced child. He went to the local village kindergarten, not an elite private institute. He played with the neighbors' children, not with carefully selected playmates. He learned simple but fundamental things: how to be kind, how to share, how to get back up when he fell. And Rosa was always there, not as an employee, but as an adopted grandmother. Her children often came to visit, and Jake played with Rosa's grandchildren, children who came from completely different worlds from his, but who taught him lessons no school could give him. One Saturday afternoon, while Rosa made cookies in the kitchen with Jake, Michael received an unexpected phone call. It was his former partner, the one who had closed the Swiss bank deal 2 years earlier. He wanted to see him urgently. They met at a coffee shop in the Hamptons. The partner looked aged, stressed. He explained that the acquisition, which seemed like the deal of the century, had turned into a disaster. The bank had hidden problems. The debts were much bigger than expected. He and the other investors were losing hundreds of millions. Some risked bankruptcy. Michael listened with compassion. 2 years earlier, he would have been in that situation. The decision that seemed like an enormous sacrifice, giving up the deal to stay with his son, had actually saved him from a financial disaster. But that wasn't what struck Michael. It was the realization that even if the deal had gone well, even if he had gained another $2 billion, he wouldn't be happier than he was now. He already had everything he needed: a son who loved him, a home full of warmth, and the wisdom to understand what really mattered. That evening, he organized a special dinner. He invited all of Rosa's children with their families. The large dining room table, which usually hosted formal business dinners, was full of adults and children laughing, talking, passing homemade pasta dishes by Rosa. At one point, Rosa's eldest son, the engineer, raised a toast. He thanked Michael for how he treated his mother, not as a housekeeper, but as a family member. He said few employers would have this sensitivity, this ability to see beyond class differences and recognize human value. But it was Michael who shook his head. He explained that he was the one who had to thank Rosa. She had saved not just his son, but also his soul. She had taught him that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, that true wisdom doesn't come from elite universities, that true success is watching your son sleep peacefully, knowing you made the right choice. Rosa, sitting at the opposite end of the table with Jake asleep in her arms, smiled. She said nothing, because there was no need for words. Everything that needed to be said had already been said through years of silent work, through the simple act of saving a child in danger, through the patience of waiting for a blind man to finally learn to see. Years later, when Jake became an adult, he often told the story of how Rosa, the housekeeper, had saved his life. But he didn't just talk about the fever and convulsions. He talked about how she had also saved his father, transforming a cold and distant billionaire into a man capable of loving. And when they asked him what was the most important lesson he had learned in life, Jake always answered the same way, that the wisest people aren't necessarily those with the most degrees or money. They're those who have lived, who have suffered, who have loved, who have hands calloused from work and hearts enlarged from experience. Rosa Martinez died at 72, surrounded by all her children, grandchildren, and Michael and Jake, who considered her family. Her funeral was small and simple, as she would have wanted, but Michael placed a marble plaque in the garden of the Hamptons estate with a simple inscription, "To Rosa, who taught us to see what really matters." And every time he looked at that plaque, Michael remembered that terrible day when his son was burning with fever, when all the money in the world meant nothing, and only the hands of a Texas housekeeper had made the difference between life and death, between darkness and light. Because sometimes true greatness doesn't come from where you expect it. It comes from the people society looks down upon, who work in the shadows, who don't have impressive titles, but who have something infinitely more precious. Wisdom earned through lived life, compassion born from suffering, and a heart big enough to save not just a sick child, but an entire family lost in the illusion that money can buy everything. Like if you believe true wisdom doesn't come from degrees, comment if you've ever met someone humble who taught you valuable lessons. Share this story of how pride was humbled and humility triumphed. Subscribe for more stories showing that a person's value isn't measured in money. Sometimes it takes a crisis to make us understand who the truly important people in our lives are. And sometimes those people have been there all along, right before our eyes, patiently waiting for us to learn to see.